Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. Thanks everyone for being here. And yeah, thanks for organizing it. It's really a nice workshop with like basically half of the UK researchers, maybe more, in this very niche field, all sitting in this room. I'm going to massively exploit all that by talking about a lot of tools that we've been developing and encourage you to all use them and contribute to them and whatnot. A bit like the previous speaker as well. So I'll be talking about basically the core work of my PhD with Josh, who you heard earlier today. Can everyone hear me all right? I hear a nasty resonance, but maybe it's just me. Right, so in terms of analyzing mixes, because that's what I have been doing, what I will be doing for a while, to understand how people mix and maybe more importantly how different mix decisions and different practices are perceived. A couple of recurring themes in previous research are the following. So first of all, there seems to be a lot of work that focuses on one single processor. For example, just how do people balance different tracks? How is a compressor used? Sometimes just considering a single source and having people manipulate that source. Now, obviously, this brings certain limitations. As you know, mixing music is a very cross-adaptive process where if you push one fader, you need to turn another knob to sort of account for the effect. So there's an inherent limitation there that I'm trying not to have in my work. A lot of it also happens in a lab environment for obvious reasons. And maybe not in the everyday environment of a mixing engineer in studio or a live situation. And this may bring certain biases, and I'd like to see how this can be done differently and if we get different results. Also, some of this research is not always evaluated. So you might have a test where you have a lot of subjects manipulating certain signal, applying some kind of compression or something. But then without a different pool of subjects assessing whether the sound coming out is actually any good or is actually similar to what you would get from a professional mixing engineer, there's another limitation there, meaning that you can't really apply the results you get from this type of research to the field of music production in general. So therefore, in this work, what I'm trying to do is collecting realistic mixes in a realistic environment. So multiple tracks, the equipment and the software that people would usually use without really bothering people with lots of survey questions as they do things. And at the same time, also assessing the perceived quality of the material that I'm getting and investigating. So not just taking it for granted and saying, okay, this is what a mix should be like, and then inferring conclusions from that, but rather asking a bunch of other people, is this a good mix, is this a bad mix, and why do you think that is? So I think it's fair to use my PhD work to the following goals. So most generally, I want to understand the process of mix engineering based on realistic mixes. I would like to also understand how descriptive terms that people might use to describe what they feel or what they hear when assessing these mixes, how these correspond to more mathematical, readily available, measurable, low-level features and parameters, so we can actually do something with the data that we collect. And one step further, I would also like to identify certain parameter spaces. So imagine that there is a mixed space within which sets of parameters make a mix sound decent, acceptable, maybe conventional, and then outside of which your mix would likely begin to sound very bold or just bad. And this is sort of a hypothesis that would be nice to check if it's possible to, given a certain parameter, given some audio, say, well, this is a likely range, even if you can't pinpoint the exact parameters where to put the parameters, because it might be that there are various different ways of mixing a song in an acceptable fashion. Maybe we can at least say, okay, this is likely the range you would want to put those parameters in. And this is going to become clearer throughout the presentation. I will show that it's possible and even necessary to mine data from poor examples. Poor examples being non-ideal mixes, because who has ideal mixes? Maybe you could argue that commercial, professional mixes are supposedly the standard or supposedly how you should mix. But then, as mentioned before, we don't really have access to those mixes and those parameter settings. So we're stuck with poor examples, but I'll go and explain why that may not be such a bad thing after all. A couple of applications, it's also a recurring theme through the previous presentations, and I think it's quite important to point out how anyone might really care about any of this. So one potential type of applications are meters, but not meters of loudness and width and spectrum, like you have them in any digital audio workstation, but maybe meters of more sophisticated, more intuitive and high-level quantities. For example, brightness could be an obvious one. Maybe amount of reverb, too much, too little. Tools that are metering tools that are not really possible with today's kind of software, but could be possible with all this knowledge that I'm trying to collect, and you are as well. And then at the same time, you can also go the other way, and given all this knowledge and given some input audio, you could maybe use this high-level information to control the low-level knobs that you usually manipulate as a mixing engineer. So first of all, there's a couple of challenges in acquiring all this data, all these mixes and evaluations that we've had to overcome. And so in the first section of my talk, I'd like to go over a couple of tools that we've developed in order to do all these different tasks. I'd like to emphasize a couple of things that I'm very happy to share with you, and maybe you could have some feedback on that. As it does seem like something that some of you might benefit from as well. In fact, I know that's the case for at least some of you. First of all, as mentioned before, multi-track audio is for some reason very hard to come by. Actually, we know the reasons. A lot of material is copyrighted. Artists and content owners are not always very happy to share it with just anyone. Sometimes because of very good commercial reasons, sometimes maybe it's a bit misguided. I know it's up to you, but the fact remains that that we don't really have a lot of high quality or even low quality multitracks that we can run analysis on, test algorithms, and use for subjective evaluation of certain techniques. So for that reason, we launched a website, and the infrastructure is actually ready. It's called the Open Multitrack Testbed, and I can actually show it right now, I think, because demos are good, I think. So this is what it looks like. So the infrastructure is there. We only just got the funding to actually link it to all the various multitrack resources that we know of that currently exist on the web, plus some audio that we have ourselves, which we're able to share because of Creative Commons licenses. So it's a very easy concept where you can, for example, look for a multitrack which has an electric piano. So you say track data, instrument, electric piano. So it gives you all the songs where, oh, no results were found. I'm pretty sure there's one with an electric piano, but maybe it's the internet. You get the idea, but I would like this to work. Electric piano. Okay. Well, it's not for today. Maybe it's not very good in Google Chrome. Anyway, this is idea. I promise you that it does work sometimes. So anyway, it doesn't really work until there's some data in there. So this is the first call towards all of you. If you know of people who have multitrack audio that can be shared, for example, because whoever owns it is fine to attach a Creative Commons license to it, so they are still attributed every time it's used, but it can be used in a commercial or maybe specifically non-commercial settings. More on that later. So this is the first thing we did, try to collect a lot of multi-track audio and then make it available as well, share it with the community. Once we did that and collected some mixes of them, there was obviously the task of perceptually evaluating these different mixes. So for this, we first created a tool in MATLAB, but for various reasons, we now moved on to a browser-based tool. It's actually quite useful to not be reliant on MATLAB with its changing behaviors and new version updates. We don't have any of that with this HTML interface. So this is something that I would like to show as well, not just to show off the tool, but also because it's basically what most of the work is based on. So if this will work, so imagine you're all a participant. This is where I need the audience participation. I hope this will, I'm just going to refresh this to be sure. Right, so please enter your name, BCU. BCU doesn't have a gender, I think. So there you go. Right, so this is a smaller test in the sense that I only added 4 samples because, well, we're pressed for time, I heard. So the idea is you're a test subject and you have to listen to different mixes which now appear in random locations on this rating axis. So let me just go ahead and play one. I hope it's not terribly loud. Your bullets cheap with smoke are rusting in my chest. Let's not say murder. So now I'll switch to the next one so you can sort of compare. We'll turn a trick on Bleecker, cross of golden listerine, bring my redemption. All right, so what did you think of mix 0 and 1? I just started with a random one. Which did you think was better? Anyone? 0? 0 was better. 1 was better. Anyone else?
More clear on 1.
Okay. So sorry, what was more clear on 1?
Vocals.
Vocals. Okay. So I'll just add this here. This is actually very interesting information. So I'm gonna write this down here. You're gonna write this down here. Vocal more. 0 is better over there. Okay. So is it fine if I say they're both fair? Okay. So then I'll move on to the next one. I'll just switch a little bit. This is 2. Murder, but I'm so old, newly 1. We'll turn a trick on Bleecker, cross of
0.
golden listerine, bring my redemption. What do you reckon?
Sounds louder and with more ambience.
Is,
the one
okay.
just played, yeah.
Right. Okay. Louder, more ambience. Is that a good thing, or?
Yeah, I suppose so.
Great.
The vocals don't sound out of the mix like in the other ones.
Okay. Great. Okay, I'll just quickly do 3 and 4. I think you get the idea by now. Your bullets cheap with smoke are rusting in my chest. Let's not say murder, but I'm so old, newly dead. We'll turn a trick on Bleecker, cross of golden listerine, bring my redemption for mommy's little queen.
0. 1.
And the city drowns, but the bar's in drag. Miss the last train out. Tragic you. All right. So 3, 4. Any comments? Where shall I put them? I'm gonna process this data real time, so I'm actually gonna do this. This is not just for me.
The 4 seems to have punchier drums.
Punchier drums. Okay. And I take it that's a good thing. Great. Okay.
I think on general comments you should put never mix like music.
Can I put it in all caps or? No, that doesn't work. Okay. Never mix in committee. Okay, so I'll just submit this. Great. And just as for the end of the demonstration, I can then just generate a report for the benefit of anyone who wants to use this, and I know a couple of you have asked me about this. Just generate a report so I can quickly see what this mix together with a couple of, with this perceptual evaluation together with a couple I did before kind of looks like. So you get this box plot, which doesn't look very pretty because we have only done a couple and we disagreed a lot. So there's that, the gender. And this is an interesting one where you can see, oh, actually, I think this is us. Yeah, so we didn't really do a lot, but you see how we moved the different sliders over time and when we played the different fragments. So this kind of diagnostics is something we missed in a couple of other interfaces where you're not really sure how much effort the user put in. All right, so I think that's it in terms of the perceptual evaluation, but I'd like to just give you an idea of what kind of data we collect for the next part. So this is, again, the progress. Then the next thing we do with all these interesting comments that we just entered, because we get a lot of various different comments that are sometimes hard to do anything with computationally. We try to sort of categorize them and attach different text to them in terms of instrument, in terms of what processor they relate to, and so on. And this gives us a couple of insights that of which I'll show you some in a bit. And all this information is then put in data structures like this one, so XML documents, which make it easy for us to process the data, to retrieve the data, but also to share it with you if anyone is interested in ratings of different mixes. And even if this is not a great format, it's quite easy to then parse it into something else, so it's quite future-proof like that. So okay, these are, yeah, so you see how you have the song name and the mix name and so on. It's all pretty obvious. And a slight deviation, so as opposed to the kind of data collection that I've done so far, that I've shown so far, so having people mixes in their natural environment and so on, and then evaluating them by other people. I've been lucky enough to also be included in the semantic audio feature extraction project with people here at BCU, as well as some people at Queen Mary. And there it's sort of the opposite kind of way of working, where the content producer, the mix engineer itself, is actually describing the process and describing what he does and what the effects of the different signal manipulations are as he is doing it, with obviously the advantage of getting a huge number of terms just by giving these plugins to people and having them use them. I won't say anything more about that because Sean is going to talk a little bit about this in this next talk, I think. But I'm quite happy sort of working at the two extremes of the ways of data collection. So the very natural, leave the mixing engineer alone and then evaluate all of that, and then the huge data collection from within the digital audio workstation, which I think is very interesting as well. So it'd be great to see what kind of results we get out of both of them, and if they correspond or contradict in some ways. So having collected all of this and having shown you how to evaluate and what kind of data we get out from this, let me talk a little bit about the analysis of all this data and what we can potentially get from this. So far, we've worked with 3 schools, and there are a couple more in the queue, where we had students mix 13 different songs and more at the moment. So we got a lot of mixes of which we don't just have the end result, so not something we could just get from Spotify or something, not just a stereo file, but we get the whole digital audio workstation file, so we can see all the settings, all the parameters that they have set, and yeah, some interesting information on how they work, what their workflow is like. So we can actually extract data from the individual tracks and not just from the stereo file. And then we just evaluated this by giving it to a lot of different subjects with the evaluation interface you just saw. So just in terms of extracting features from the mix, we can also already see a couple of interesting results here. So this is just the average spectrum of a set of mixes that we had, and we were pleasantly surprised to see that the averages, which are in blue, and then the standard deviations in red, corresponded quite well with the green dashed line, where the green dashed line is the average spectrum, so octave band spectrum, of all number one hits, I guess, since 2000. So it kind of corresponds quite well with the contemporary spectrum of music. We've also been able to confirm a hypothesis that was mentioned but never really proven in a lot of academic literature, as well as practical mixed literature, where this shows the stereo panning spectrum. So you can see that the higher the frequency, the more the signal is likely to be panned. So in other words, higher sounding sources are panned more to the sides, whereas low frequency sources usually tend to be pan centered. And then some other interesting things, like we've been able to localize the vocal in a quite tight interval around -3 loudness units versus the total loudness of the mix. So these are all very interesting findings that we can find by just crunching all the data of all the different mixes that we have. But it's somewhat limited and potentially noisy, because it does include mixes, student mixes in this case, which may or may not be examples of a perfect mix, and therefore maybe not very relevant to what we actually want to find out, supposing that what we want to find out is how to make a good mix and how do people mix maybe in a commercial or professional setting. So that's potentially noisy, and this is where the subjective evaluation comes in. We're also not quite sure what to look for, so just taking all this data and crunching the numbers and extracting different features and finding high correlations for a certain MFCC and so on, it doesn't necessarily tell us what the listeners actually care about. Like maybe the balance of the different sources is only half the story. Maybe a certain spectral contour feature doesn't really tell you anything about what makes a good mixer. Maybe there's very little meaning embedded in there. So there again, adding the subjective evaluation changes that. Just looking at the ratings that we extracted here, so basically everything we got from moving the sliders on the rating axis just before. Just looking at that in isolation is again quite interesting in this case, where the red X's are the rating that that a mix engineer attributes to his own mix, obviously in a blind evaluation, but there seems to be quite a strong preference for one's own mix, which could have a couple of reasons. So it might be that there's a consistent style that someone has, both when listening to music and when producing the music himself, that they just consistently adhere to. Another possibility is obviously that there's a certain bias because they have mixed this song about 2 weeks before that, so they might either recognize their mix or at least made up their mind about certain decisions in the mix, and therefore there might be a bit of bias here. And adding this rating information to the features that we extracted can tell us a little bit about the correlation of such features with preference, and maybe tell us that a mix which is overly bright is likely to be evaluated poorly. Well, that's a kind of a poor example, but it does give us a bit of information about spatial and dynamic and spectral features and how they sort of correlate with the preference for different mixes. Here again, there's an issue that, first of all, we would need a very large and diverse amount of data to reliably say, well, this correlation holds in every case, or this is very likely to be true for music in general. But furthermore, there's not going to be, it's very unlikely that there's going to be one low-level feature which tells us everything we need to know about how good is this mix. It's more likely that using specialized, complex, and likely perceptually motivated features, maybe a set of different features, are correlating better with, or maybe can give us some predictive power to say, well, this mix is probably not going to be a good one because we measured this and this. So that's a whole can of worms that we'll likely try to tackle a little bit soon. But moving on to the comments that we extract as well, I'd like to think that these comments are actually quite effective at sort of pinpointing the different issues with the mix. So you don't just have a rating, so you can say these mixes are good and these mixes are bad, but you actually get some in-depth information on this particular vocal treatment is done right, this snare drum is not punchy enough, and so on. And allows you to really zoom in on where the issues lie and gives you actual information. And that also doesn't require a huge amount of mixes to be able to get some meaningful number or correlation. Just looking at the comments, we can already infer a couple of things in terms of what is important for certain groups of people when listening to these mixes and assessing them. So here for I guess not professional, but going to be professional mixing engineers, we can see that vocal is a very, maybe unsurprisingly, a very important one that is mentioned quite a lot in the subjective evaluation of these different mixes. And you mentioned it before as well, so there's that. But I would argue that taking these features and ratings and comments together is actually the most effective at getting us some useful information. So it might allow us to answer questions like, what do certain individual words like bright and punchy and muddy and so on, what do they mean, how can they be mathematized? Which choices are liked and which choices are disliked, where and even where lies the boundary of too much reverb, too little reverb on a vocal in a certain genre, and so on. I would argue the combination of these three actually gives us the power to say some things with this relatively limited set of very complex data where everything seems to depend on everything. So just a small proof of concept that I'll improve upon soon, hopefully. So these are all the different mixes from a data set from one school where the different shapes are different songs. And they are plotted in terms of the objective features, spectral centroid, and brightness, which is an MIR feature. So then looking at the different comments in a not very systematic way, or at least not yet. If we say, okay, so these are the, this is a mix where a lot of people, let's say at least 5 people said, well, this is too bright or brittle or whatever word they're using. I think bright is a very important one. Mix is too bright, everything edgy. There's a couple of funny comments as well. I haven't included them all. So we can sort of find a boundary here where we say, okay, so everything beyond this line is clearly, a lot of people agree on this mix is too bright. The same happens at the bottom end where the operative words are dark and muddy and thick, muffled, boomy. So you can again find a couple of mixes where this is clearly beyond the acceptable, and everybody seems to agree that there's something seriously wrong with this. So we hope to narrow this a little bit and to make it a bit more powerful than this, but this is where this is going. So we've been very lucky to get all these kind of mixes from educational institutions and students who are contributing mixes and also participating in the evaluation, and it's been really quite interesting. It turns out that they're actually quite happy to do just that, because for them it's a unique type of feedback that they are getting, where through blind peer review of their mixes, they're actually getting multiple perspectives, a lot of reviews almost of their of each individual mix, all of that anonymous, obviously, and as opposed to what we usually get, which is one teacher saying what they think based on considerable experience, but it would be just one person's view. And at the same time, it's also the critical listening exercise, which is apparently quite interesting, where they have to actually learn to listen to various aspects of a mix, especially interesting when they're relatively inexperienced students at an early stage. They have to make decisions about what they like. So you experienced this before. You're given two mixes, and both are have their strengths and both have their weaknesses. But you have to decide which you like and sort of make up your mind about who you're going to be as a mix engineer, and what you like over other things. And it also just demonstrates, I'm not sure if this was clear on these speakers, but it demonstrates how different mixes can actually be really different and kind of make a song completely different. So that's also quite revealing. Okay, so at this point, I would just like to leave you with a couple of light conclusions. First of all, we can learn from bad examples, and I think this should even be, we should learn from bad examples, because a couple of the things that we've seen on previous plots wouldn't really be possible to find out without bad examples as well, and mixes which are on the verge of too bright or maybe bright enough and so on. If we would have all ideal mixes, we couldn't really explore where the acceptable region kind of ends, and a lot of applications that I mentioned before wouldn't really be possible to develop. If we have limited data, which is inherently the case in this kind of work, we can use subjective evaluation to zone in on certain issues. We can filter out poor mixes that we don't want to include for a certain research question. And we can also use subjective evaluation, the comments, especially if we annotate them, so we can actually use them in a more automated way. We can zone in on the certain issues that we want to look at more closely. And that actually makes data which is quite complex and makes it possible to actually infer anything from that data. And I like to think I'm sort of creating a framework for defining these descriptive terms that I've shown you, like bright, like muddy, and muffled, and punchy, in music and maybe sound in general. So at this point, I'll just like to repeat there's a couple of resources that we have which are absolutely free for you to use. I would be very happy if you did. And obviously all feedback, but also contributions, especially to the multi-track testbed, which is currently rather empty, would be highly appreciated. And more things will be published as I go on my personal website. So again, if you're an educator or indeed a mixing engineer and you would like to help me create mixes or assess mixes or both, that would be highly appreciated, or donate any content you may have. And at this point, I'd be very happy to answer a question or two. Thank you very much.